What actually adds to the quality of the discussion in a classroom at a higher education institution? Diversity of lifestyle also is something that you don't want everyone to come from the same walk of life. You don't want everyone to have the same ideology. That is not the rigor of, but I also
And you may also
say,
not want them to have the same test scores.
That's right.
What? What are you talking? Okay, I really don't understand.
Some black school districts that aren't getting the money that they're supposed to get, and I'm defining them that way because our schools are still segregated.
And yes, schools should be fairly funded, but what funds schools?
From 2020, even in that year, many companies did, again, symbolic postings on their websites, but to do real DEI work takes the intervention is not just one office with one person who does a webinar once a year during Black History Month or Women's History Month. You really have to evaluate your practices.
Before she gets too deep, I just want to ask, what is considered, and this is a real question, if you guys know, comment down below. What exactly is considered real DEI work? And the reason I'm asking that is because the whole phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion is used to create an environment where everyone has a fair chance, everyone has a fair shot at success. So I'm assuming she's saying the work that's happening right now, or which was happening prior to Donald Trump, wasn't real DEI work. It was not real DEI work. And we need to foster an environment that does have real DEI work. So if that wasn't real DEI work, then what is? I'm not attacking her. I just want to know, what is real DEI work?
Your protocols and really make a long-term commitment. It takes time to change some of the practices that work, and you have to decide you want to do it. Now, I do think the analysis may say it's not going away, but we do know after the Supreme Court affirmative action decision, beyond just higher education institutions, many corporations, many other institutions started to look at that as a signal that they could start rolling their DEI practices. And to add the cultural component on top of it, it is not as if some people of a certain political party have not even used the word DEI as a trope, as a slang, as a term of slander. And so the question is, like, what is the real intention behind your work you do with
Well,
DEI?
you know, I think you raise an excellent point. Actually, I know something about this because my nonprofit, Lift Our Voices, focuses on this. And I can tell you, you're absolutely right. You have a tremendous number of companies that have these great ads where they're talking about their diversity, equity, inclusion work, but the work doesn't actually exist. And what they do is they silence their workers with forced arbitration and NDAs on the first day of work, which means that if you are racially discriminated against, the very same companies, and I know who they are, you're watching these commercials where they're constantly having, the African-American husband with the Asian wife, and they're talking about how, they're all about inclusion. And in reality, what they're doing is they're telling their African-American workers or their female workers or their gay or lesbian workers, keep your mouths shut because you have...
I love that she said that because a company probably would try to silence their workers, but this is why it's important to know your rights as an American citizen. What is it called? A NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, cannot supersede the American law. For example, if I go to a company and I sign an NDA and it says, if we discriminate racially against you, you cannot sue us. You can make me sign this if I want to work here. However, if I have proof that you racially discriminated against me and I sue you and we go to the Supreme Court, they're going to look at the Constitution. They're going to look at the Civil Rights Act. Yes, the NDA exists, but does this NDA supersede the American law? I don't think it does. Or at least I would hope it doesn't. But you guys would know more about that than I do. Let's continue.
Have an arbitration clause or an NDA, and you can't talk about what's going on at this company. And so, the hypocrisy I could do without. And actually, we're launching in January a corporate rating system that would be able to tell you which of these companies silence their workers. I think that is the key to making sure that you have a diverse workforce, because by doing these silencing mechanisms, they're driving out the very people they pretend to want to enfranchise, because it's people of color and women who are mostly affected by them. And they're being driven out of the workforce, out of their chosen careers because of these silencing mechanisms. I think it is crucial to get rid of those.
Ashley also mentioned higher education. I mean, we did get some signals about what's been going on in higher education at Harvard. Harvard Law they saw a huge decline in Black and Hispanic students. They enrolled 19 first-year Black students, 3% of the class, the lowest number since the 1960s. The school also saw a steep decline for Hispanic students, just 39 students, a fall from 63 back in 2023. So there's been a clear decline as a result of, this is the affirmative action ruling from the Supreme Court.
I mean, I think some universities were using these policies to discriminate against Asian students and other kinds of students. So, pick your discrimination. Who do you want to be discriminated against? Wouldn't the fair way to do it would be to say, we're going to look at everybody's test scores, we're going to look at everybody's applications, and we're going to do it agnostic of race, and we're going to let the most talented and the most accomplished students come to our universities. You mentioned
what he said actually has a lot of merit, no pun intended. This whole concept of, this whole concept of DEI, it makes sense. You don't want a group of people who face systemic barriers to be punished, to be forever put into a caste system where they're not able to move up in society. However, I'm having problems understanding how that is happening in America. And what I mean is, I don't think America is a caste system. And I know this because I study caste systems. In America, you can move up no matter what or where you're from. It will be harder if you're from an environment where you weren't studying since you were 5 or 6 years old. It will be harder to get into Harvard or an Ivy League institution if you didn't study SATs since you were in elementary school, but that's America. You shouldn't punish the kid who was studying when they were 11, 12 years old for the SATs and reward the one who wasn't. I just don't understand it. And I'm trying to make sense of, the leftist approach to DEI, but it just doesn't make much sense to me. You can't look at one kid and say, oh, your grades are too high or your scores are too high, and say, we're going to pick someone who has lower scores and lower grades because they had a harder life. First off, how could you prove that they've had a harder life? Second of all, if you're going off of picking the best students and you have a standard on how you decide which students are the best, how are you going against your own standard? It just confuses me so much in reality. It really, really, really confuses me. And I try to make sense of it, but I just can't. I don't know.
the Supreme Court ruling, by the way, on affirmative action, which I do believe was a seminal moment because it reminded me when it happened that a vast majority of Americans do not want affirmative action. They do not believe in these forced racial preferences. And even a majority of African Americans agreed with the ruling at the time. And so when some people, often accuse Republicans are on the right, but I think a lot of Americans all across the spectrum look at this and say, I want to rise and fall based on my own talent and my own hard work. I don't want to rise and fall based on the pressures being put on me by people who don't know how much work I'm putting in.
Well, let's talk about fairness, because I think when you talk about fairness in education and bringing people in according to their grades and according to their test scores, first you have to fairly fund the schools that they come from. In Pennsylvania, we just had a ruling that said that our schools are unfairly funded according to poverty, right? And so it's not just race, it's poverty as well. And so there are some white school districts that aren't getting the money that they're supposed to get. There are some black school districts that aren't getting the money that they're supposed to get. And I'm defining them that way because our schools are still segregated.
But even this, he said they should fairly fund the schools. And yes, schools should be fairly funded. But what funds schools? Taxes fund schools. County taxes, state taxes, community taxes fund schools. So if you're saying schools are underfunded, but their community just makes less money, and you want those schools to be funded more money, doesn't that mean that they're not being fairly funded? Because if one community makes more money, their schools should have more funding than the community who makes less money. That's fairly funding. But if you want to get the community who makes less money and bring them to the level of the community who makes more money and give them the same amount of funding, then technically this community is getting more funding based off of how much money their community makes. I hope I didn't confuse anyone, but what he's saying is not fair in nature. It's really not fair. But let's continue.
Even after Brown versus the Board of Education,
I was also
separate is not equal.
I was
It's
just reading
not.
a headline from the New York Times today about a lawsuit against a bunch of elite schools, Georgetown, Penn, and MIT. And guess what the preferences are? For people whose mommies and daddies have a lot of money, and they just got a ticket into the school. I just don't get, where's the outrage about that? That's been going on in this country for hundreds of years.
Oh, I don't agree with that either.
legacies have always been-
Where's the outrage? Why are we only focused on race when this is
a class
affirmative
argument.
action?
But I do have something to say about what you just said.
No, I just wanted to say that I think that the whole issue of DEI became much more prevalent when there were issues in the military. I think a lot of people were very put off by some of the contradictions, concerned that our soldiers weren't really ready for their missions and were more concerned about DEI or more concerned about their pronouns that they used. And this was, I think, part of what really set off a lot of Republicans and conservatives that, you know, they started to look into DEI initiatives and are they working and what do they really mean?
I think one of the things about the affirmative action decision that is a misconception is that there is this belief of what is the merit-based system if you're just looking at grades, but what actually adds to the quality of the discussion in a classroom at a higher education institution. Diversity of lifestyle also is something that you don't want everyone to come from the same walk of life. You don't want everyone to have the same ideology. That is not the rigor of, but I also
And you may
will
also
say,
not want them to have the same test scores.
that's
too.
right. But you also,
What? What are you talking? Okay, I really don't understand this. I really don't get it. I don't get it. What do you mean you don't want them to have the same test scores? Then why do you have a benchmark test score? And yes, you probably don't want the same exact type of student in the class. You don't want to see everyone the same, I guess. If you want diversity, whatever. But in America, there is natural diversity. And I think sometimes we forget that, meaning that America is probably the most diverse country in the world in regards to superpowers in the world, like Russia, China, America. We are the most diverse. So there's just natural diversity, yeah. But then you're saying you don't want people to have the same test scores? I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want people to have the same level of test scores? Jesus. I think the problem is people on the left and people on the right just look at diversity differently. And I honestly believe that, because when I hear you speak, I'm like, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't you want people to have the same test scores? Anyways, I'm gonna end this here. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I don't know. I'll see you guys later.